Hello and welcome to a special edition of Washington Talk on the U.S. presidential election. I'm Eun-jung Cho. President Donald Trump returns to the White House for a second term. President Trump has promised sweeping action in his second administration, and the changes will be felt around the world. Today we discuss what President Trump's second term will mean for the world, especially the two Koreas.
This is a magnificent victory for the American people that will allow us to make America great again. We stopped the missile launches from North Korea. Now North Korea is acting up again, but when we get back, I get along with them.
한미동맹을 바탕으로 해서 강력한 그 연대와 파트너십을 갖자.
In the studio with me, Ambassador James Jeffrey, chair of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. Ambassador Jeffrey was the special representative for Syria engagement and the special envoy for the global coalition to defeat ISIS. Ambassador Jeffrey also served as the deputy national security advisor during the George W. Bush administration. He was also the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, Turkey, and to Albania. Dr. James Carafano, Senior Counselor to the President and Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Dr. Carafano previously served as the Vice President of the Heritage Foundation. He also served on the first Trump administration's transition team as Head for Foreign Policy. Ambassador Daniel Freed, a Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Ambassador Freed was the U.S. Ambassador to Poland and Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. He also served as the State Department Coordinator for Sanctions Policy. welcome to the program.
Thanks for having us.
Now, Ambassador Jeffrey, in his victory speech, President Trump promised to put America first. What will be the key features of the second Trump administration's foreign policy?
First, thanks for having me on, Eun-jung. Second, neither I nor anybody else can predict what any new president will do, and above all else, Donald Trump. That said, we have some indications from his first term in which I served as in those positions that you mentioned. I would say that every president wants to put America first, and every president, including Trump in his first term, understands that that requires engagement with the world. We keep ourselves safe and prosperous by keeping others safe and prosperous. That has been our watchword for almost 100 years. How Trump carries that policy out, we will have to see, but I do not, at this point, believe that there will be a dramatic change in what has been a pretty consistent American policy for the last few decades.
But President Trump promised sweeping changes, and the things that he said on campaign trail are very different from the Biden administration's policy. President Trump doesn't want to be involved in any wars, and President Trump is very transactional when it comes to trade. How can it be very same as in the previous administration?
Well, it's funny because I'm not an economic expert, but the Biden administration continued many of the tariff and other policies of an industrial policy that President Trump was recommending. That was the big shift. It began with Trump and was continued by Biden, and Trump will simply reinforce it. But in terms of not wanting to get involved in wars, most American presidents don't. They don't go to wars. Wars come to us.
Ambassador Freed, U.S. allies have embraced the Biden administration's value-based strategic cooperation. Should they move quickly towards transactional approaches to the United States? How does President Trump's worldview differ from traditional U.S. presidents?
I'm in general agreement with Ambassador Jeffrey. There is a view that the Trump administration means the end of Pax Americana, that one of my colleagues wrote in Politico. I don't think this is necessarily the case. President Trump will have a different way of defining American interests, and he does have a transactional style. I think it will be important for European countries and maybe for South Korea, though I'm hardly an expert, to make the case to the Trump administration how that alliance serves combined interests, that it is not a case of America doing the heavy lifting of defense while European countries and South Korea take advantage of us economically. President Trump, well, as president and candidate, made that complaint. In fact, the economic ties we have with South Korea and with the free countries of Asia and with Europe benefit us all. But I think that the focus of the Trump administration may be, and in my view should be, on dealing with the adversaries that threaten us all, Russia, China, Iran. That gives us a strong basis, a strong platform to work with South Korea and with Europe in common purpose. And so that's where I think there is an excellent chance of going with this new administration.
Dr. Carafano, Ambassador Freed just raised the importance of how President Trump deals with the enemy states. And this is a time when China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran are solidifying their alignment. How do you think President Trump will approach them differently, and how would that be in American interest? And President Trump in the campaign trail complained that it is the allies that's been treating U.S. so badly and not the enemies.
Well, first of all, 안녕하세요. This could be like a really, really boring afternoon, but because I agree on most things. So what's really interesting is, and I think both ambassadors made the point is, when we have an election, we focus on what's going to change, and what we completely ignore is the continuities. America's genuine interests don't change, geopolitics don't change, geography doesn't change, the current challenges in the world don't change. So one thing that I feel really confident about is that regardless of what the election is, the focus of U.S. policy in terms of dealing with adversarial relationships is going to be China, Russia, Iran, and we'll see how North Korea fits in there. Now, why do I say that? Because every American president for the last 5 presidents has said, I don't want to live in that world. And it doesn't, and I'll reset with the Russians, I'll figure out the Chinese, we'll try to, and they all wind up back in the same place. And so this is not going to change for 2 reasons. One is these countries want to have an adversarial relationship with the United States. They think the only way they can really advance their interests is by having an adversarial relationship with the United States. And so I think that clearly the focus of American power is dealing with them as adversarial policy. If you look at this from the American perspective, regardless of who's in the White House, when you say transactional, yeah, sure, Trump's transactional. What does that mean? It means he bases foreign policy on outcomes he's trying to achieve. Well, what are those outcomes measured on? Well, they're measured on the things that are important to the United States, our interests. What derives our interests? Well, our interests are largely derived from our values. So in terms of the metric of what presidents are trying to do, it's not that different. So American foreign policy, regardless of the president, devolves back to these parts of the world need to be stable. I don't think a Trump foreign policy is going to be any different than that.
Quickly, one thing that will be different. President Trump saw the pacing challenge not only militarily, but also in terms of global threat, economic competition, as correctly China, 2016 to 2020, and he was right. But now, as this axis of aggressive evil consolidates, it's consolidating around Russia. It's not economically or militarily the biggest challenge, but it's the one that is driving military competition in Ukraine in supporting North Korea's aggressive policies towards the south that we've talked about before, and Iran's activities in the region. China, from my own contacts and what I've read, is actually trying to slow down the actions of Russia and North Korea and Iran more than fuel them. So that's a difference of perspective that will be very important for President Trump to understand.
Let me jump in also.
Okay.
I agree with what both of my colleagues have said. I think there are 2 potential mistakes that any administration, this administration coming in or any, could make. One is to regard European and Asian security as separate and separable. This just isn't true. I mean, even before the North Korean troops appeared in Ukraine, it's clear that this is an axis of aggression, or as Condi Rice has put it, axis of losers. A second fallacy is that we can peel away Russia the better to deal with China by giving them concessions. And that's linked to a view of the world that says that great powers should have sphere of influence and we should draw lines on a map. That really doesn't work out very well. It would, if I had to argue the America First case of why spheres of influence is a bad idea, it would be that it diminishes us.
Do you think that cooperation between NATO countries and IP4 will hold when President Trump himself is very doubtful about NATO?
I think President Trump's doubts about NATO have to do with the fact that a lot of the European countries, especially Germany, aren't spending enough on defense. And so his argument, which has a basis, is that America's been shouldering this burden. The Europeans, particularly the Germans, have been free riders. Now, that's exaggerated, but it is not without merit. American presidents since Eisenhower have been frustrated by the lack of European military spending, and the Germans have disarmed to a significant and dangerous degree since the end of the Cold War. There are other Europeans, particularly the Poles, the Finns, who are arming because they understand their lives depend on having a military that works. So if the Europeans want to get along with Trump, they're going to have to put more skin in the game. And then President Trump will be in a position to say, look, I was rough, but that's what it took to save NATO.
I don't think there was ever in the cards that a Republican administration would leave NATO or abandon Ukraine. I just don't think that's going to happen. Let me just say, I think that Ambassador is exactly right. The cornerstone of Trump's foreign policy is Europeans need to do more in NATO's defense. And because the only way the United States is ever going to shift additional resources, particularly in the security and diplomatic space, into the Indo-Pacific is not by abandoning Europe and the Middle East, because then they'll just have a fire in their own backyards. It's by ensuring that those theaters are stable. That's what's going to free up resources to move east.
Mm-hmm. That's right. However, to introduce a note of concern, Ukraine may be something the Trump administration has to deal with quickly.
24 hours
well,
since the
President
inauguration.
Trump now, he did.
And if President Trump pulls out, then what should South Korea do? Should South Korea still consider sending lethal weapons to Ukraine when U.S. is trying to pull out?
I don't think the U.S. is necessarily going to pull out.
It's going to end the war in 24 hours.
Well, President Trump said so. And Vice President-elect Vance, during the campaign, said that a deal he might support is a ceasefire in place, Ukrainian neutrality, and helping Ukraine fortify that border. Now, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday that said that this could actually be the Trump administration plan. I noticed that yesterday 2 senior Kremlin-linked former officials, Karaganov and Dmitry Trenin, dumped all over that and demanded surrender. Mm-hmm. If the Kremlin believes that Trump is a pushover or a sucker, right, and that they can dictate terms, they might find that it backfires.
Yeah. The more South Korea helps Ukraine, along with other countries, right, the happier Trump will be with a help Ukraine policy, because you feel that he's not being made to do it all by himself. That's really important for him.
And there are people in the United States that just say the way we prioritize is we just abandon Europe and abandon the Middle East and pivot to Asia, which is ridiculous. So you have to stabilize those theaters if you want to do more in Asia. But the reality is all our allies in Asia, particularly South Korea, that really wanted to work with the United States, what are they doing? They're pivoting to Europe. They're building relations and partnerships with Europe because they realize...
So South Korea should still send lethal weapons to Ukraine, you think?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Because it is one fight. And I think you're right. Nothing would make Donald Trump more than recognizing not just that all the allies kind of get this and that we're all in this together. So I think that's exactly the right thing. Asia needs to continue to pivot to Europe. and build that solidarity.
Ambassador Jeffrey, President Trump said South Korea is a money machine and that if he was in the White House, they'd be paying $10 billion a year, which is 9 times more than what South Korea is shouldering at this point. Do you think South Korea should be favorable to President Trump's demands so that he doesn't reconsider any U.S. troop commitment to the Korean Peninsula?
It's always difficult to predict the future, but this one is pretty easy because we've seen this movie before. President Trump has said the same thing to the Europeans. The Koreans have actually done better than most countries, and they will be able to negotiate with Trump on some kind of deal. I can't predict what it would be. Well, we'll pay the same percentage of our GDP now that we agreed to in your first administration, and that, of course, will be more money. There'll be some kind of deal that will be worked out. I am absolutely sure. President Trump, remember, twice said he was pulling troops out of Syria. They're still there. Why? Because we explained to him why they were serving American and global interests, and he bought that argument. He is capable of buying that argument in Korea or anyplace else.
Dr. Carafano, South Korea spends 2.5% of GDP in defense spending. Polls that Ambassador Fried mentioned spends 5% of GDP in 2025 on defense. Israel, 6%. Do you think there's still room that South Korea can spend more with or without Trump?
Well, look, I think we've got to reset the question from talking about percentages of GDP spending to talk about what capabilities are we delivering and what the partnerships are. So, for example, I think the value of Korean investments in Europe, the defense deal with Poland, other countries, that's extremely important. So we have to start talking about what kind of capabilities we're bringing to the table. And look, the clear winner in all this, Taiwan. Because you have to remember, Trump walks in with a very different situation in Northeast Asia than he was confronted the first time. First, he has a Korean and Japanese ally that actually talk to each other, which he didn't have. He's got governments which are, I think, getting much more like-minded in terms of global security needs, which he didn't have before. And so there's a lot more commonality there. And the thing is, if you value those relationships and what they bring to the United States, Taiwan is non-negotiable. You cannot lose Taiwan and maintain a security situation in Northeast Asia you have. So this triangle of Korea, Japan, Taiwan linking to the United States, I don't see how that doesn't grow. And I think the ambassador said it really well. And Syria was also true in Afghanistan. The team went to him and made a case of why it's in America's interest. And what Trump didn't do was dismiss him. He says, okay, I get that. I just don't like the way things are. I want a better deal. And so he pushes for a better deal, which in the end turns out to be not just better for the United States, but for everybody. If they'd listened to Trump and they hadn't done Nord Stream 2 and they'd hit 2%, do you think that the second invasion of Ukraine would have ever happened?
Now, I want to talk about North Korea. Dr. Carafano, North Korea test-fired huge new solid-fuel ICBM Hwasong-19, which could range anywhere in the United States. And South Koreans are worried that President Trump could go for a small deal of limiting ICBM capability and trading with sanctions relief. Do you think President Trump would forego complete denuclearization of North Korea?
Well, I would say it would be a mistake that there is really nothing valuable in this negotiation, that it doesn't end in complete denuclearization. I will say from the U.S. side, I think there's less of a case for a small deal. There's bipartisan support for nuclear modernization in the United States. We're going to build out our capability, which is pretty massive. We're going to build out space. We're going to build out missile defense. So I think in terms of capability of defending the United States, we're going to have growing confidence, and we won't need this small deal. And the other thing, like I said, is you've got South Korea, Japan, Taiwan all pulling in the right direction. Now, why would you enter a negotiation with the North Koreans out of weakness? So the big variable, which I think these guys maybe can speak to better than me, is that he didn't have in 2016 is North Korea's done some really bad things. Throwing in troops into the war against Ukraine, even though right now it's a week's worth of casualties.
Why didn't you put North Korea in the box of adversaries earlier in the discussion? You said we're going to have to look about North Korea.
Because and nothing against my good North Korean enemies, who I faced off on in the DMZ. They're fine, but North Korea cannot destabilize the world in the way that the Iranians, Russians, and Chinese have, just because of geopolitical proximity. The only thing the North Koreans can really do is kind of mess up all of Northeast Asia, which is a bad thing. Don't get me wrong. But when I look and I see South Korea, Japan pulling together, Taiwan getting more serious about its own defense, I think it's a regional problem. The other things I think have global implications. I think North Korea made an enormous mistake by going all in with Russia on this. And I think if Kim doesn't rapidly reverse that between now and January, and he doesn't start out in a better place with Donald Trump, he has dug himself, I think, a very, very deep hole. The Chinese economy is not what it used to be. The Chinese are actually getting, as you said, more risk averse about dealing with the United States. The Russians are going to have less to contribute. I think this was among the many, many really, really bad decisions Kim has made. I think this one is really bad.
Ambassador Fried, but North Korea can strike anywhere in the United States with ICBM. Wouldn't that change calculus completely?
I think that Donald Trump, no more than Joe Biden, is going to tolerate North Korean threats. And we do have the capability of dealing with them. I think that all the problems get better if Russia is defeated in Ukraine and North Korea's adventure is smashed. Condi Rice, our former boss, used the phrase, smash them together. Don't try to pick apart the coalition, the axis of aggression, but force the Chinese to recognize that they've aligned themselves with a bunch of losers. Unlike the Russians, the Chinese actually get a lot out of the international order that the U.S. has led. But they're gaming it, they're taking advantage of it, and they're supporting Russia in its aggression. They need to face the consequences of that. And I think, as Dr. Carafano said, if the North Koreans keep pushing, Trump will decide that they are really an enemy, and he's not going to reach out to them, and they could find out that they have badly misjudged Donald Trump. Putin may regard Trump as a sucker or somebody he can manipulate, but if they are arrogant and take Trump for granted, he could respond in ways that Putin would regret. So I think a better set of outcomes is possible. I do want to underscore that Trump will be certainly looking for allies to carry more of the burden. And you mentioned South Korean defense spending. Well, given those circumstances, that the capabilities need to go up. Dr. Carafano is right, it's not a question of numbers, but the numbers have taken on a political significance in Washington and probably for Donald Trump himself. And I think South Korea needs to do that so that Trump is in a position to say, because he likes to do deals, this is a grand deal. The South Koreans are in, they're helping us, and I'm going to help them. I've gotten a better deal. And what I've told the Europeans is, it doesn't matter that you don't like Donald Trump. Work the issues. Just come up with a grand bargain to work with this administration. Everybody's going to end up better.
Ambassador Jeffrey, President Trump emphasized during the campaign that he's going to get along with Kim Jong-un. President Yoon Suk-yeol of South Korea has a very different view of North Korea and Kim Jong-un. How can President Trump and President Yoon bridge the gap in dealing with the North Koreans?
Through diplomacy. The South Koreans have shown many times, I served with them in Vietnam, that they are very reliable allies. And working on that account will build a lot of credit with President Trump and with his team. Secondly, the United States can show it's a strong ally of South Korea. You mentioned a moment ago the new ICBM test. That's worrisome like everything else, but I had that account in the Bush administration. We could take care of North Korean ICBMs then, and what we've recently seen with the Iranian version of ballistic missiles, many of them from the same sources as North Koreans, is they can be shot down. We're not all that worried about them.
Well, on that note, thank you very much for joining our discussion.
Thanks for having us.
Sure.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.